In May 2022, Drake and Universal Music Group announced an expanded partnership reportedly valued at approximately $400 million. By 2025, he was suing them.
The rap war between Drake and Universal Music Group is escalating tonight,
alleging the label deliberately undermined his commercial value during a public feud to gain leverage in contract renegotiations. What happened in between wasn't a collapse, it was a countdown. In May 2022, Drake was 35 years old and Spotify's most streamed artist from 2015 to 2021. He'd been with Universal since 2009, moving through Young Money Entertainment and Universal Motown before landing at Republic Records. The 2022 deal expanded that relationship across both recording and publishing through Universal Music Publishing Group. Industry sources estimated the value at approximately $400 million, though neither party confirmed whether this represented guaranteed payment or total potential value over the contract term. What was confirmed? The label called it an expanded partnership, not an acquisition. According to reports, he retained ownership of his masters rather than selling his catalog outright, though the specific arrangement, whether full ownership with a limited-term licensing, a co-ownership structure, or eventual reversion rights, wasn't detailed publicly. This mattered because the industry context at the time was catalog sales. Between 2020 and 2022, Bob Dylan sold his publishing catalog for over $300 million. Bruce Springsteen sold his entire catalog to Sony for approximately $500 million, and Neil Young, Sting, and others followed similar paths. These were full sales, artists cashing out on decades of work, transferring ownership and future revenue rights to buyers. Drake chose the opposite structure. The deal allowed him to continue releasing music through Republic Records under terms that weren't public. In June 2022, he released Honestly Nevermind. In October 2023, he released For All the Dogs. Both albums performed commercially. The partnership appeared to function without friction. Releases continued, distribution operated as expected, and neither side commented publicly on the deal's mechanics beyond the initial announcement. But the structure relied on assumptions that weren't tested yet. His streaming dominance would need to hold without shift. Universal's commercial interest in maximizing any given release would need to align with his brand interests. And the ownership split, where he retained his post-2022 masters, but the label still controlled his legacy catalog from his first 5 albums, acquired through their 2020 purchase of Young Money Cash Money, would need to remain uncontested when the contract came up for renegotiation. The deal's term length remained confidential. Specific obligations such as minimum album deliveries weren't disclosed. Whether the partnership extended to revenue streams beyond recording and publishing, such as touring, merchandise, or endorsements, wasn't confirmed. The exact structure of the reported $400 million figure was never clarified. What was clear was that he referenced the deal himself. In his 2024 track Family Matters, released during his public feud with Kendrick Lamar, he framed his last contract as $400 million and described it as a low ball by current standards. The lyric confirmed the deal's reported value and framed it as proof of his commercial position.
My last record deal was 400 M's. These days, that's a low ball, nigga.
But it also revealed he was already thinking about what came next. The deal had a horizon. No one knew when that horizon arrived until it mattered. By 2022, he was Spotify's top artist over a 6-year span. Streaming had stabilized as the dominant revenue model, and his performance could be tracked month to month across platforms. His peers were selling catalogs for hundreds of millions. If Universal wanted to keep him in the system and keep releasing new music rather than just administering old hits, they had to compete with that exit option. A partnership structure with ownership retention meant he could continue releasing while the label secured continued access to new releases and maintained the relationship. The label's constraint was different. Losing Drake to independence or a competitor would mean losing one of the most commercially reliable artists in streaming. They had already invested in his career since 2009. They controlled his legacy catalog, which generated significant revenue. Keeping him on their roster maintained vertical integration and ensured new music flowed through their distribution system. But the company also faced a structural pressure. If his next contract negotiation arrived, the financial terms could shift. The term wasn't disclosed, but the partnership structure allowed both sides to continue operating under the existing framework. Drake's constraint was also time-bound. He had potentially decades of output ahead, but his peak streaming years might not last forever. The reported $400 million, or the security of a major label partnership, provided financial certainty without giving up ownership of future work. but it also meant he couldn't fully cash out the way his contemporaries did. Neither side publicly addressed what would happen when the contract came up for renewal. Neither side publicly confirmed whether there were minimum delivery requirements or how much creative control he retained, and neither side clarified what happened if their incentives diverged during a crisis. The structure worked as long as their interests aligned. In 2024, those interests were tested in public. Drake and Kendrick Lamar engaged in one of hip-hop's most public feuds, a diss track that became a viral and commercial success, reportedly boosted by algorithmic placement and playlist priority on streaming platforms distributed by Universal. In January 2025, the lawsuit arrived, alleging the label intentionally promoted Lamar's track to damage his brand and commercial value. According to the legal filings, this wasn't just competition between artists, it was a calculated move to weaken his negotiating position heading into his 2025 contract renegotiation. The lawsuit specifically named Lucian Grange, Universal's CEO and the executive, who had overseen the label's relationship with Drake since 2009, alleging that the company under Grange's leadership prioritized short-term streaming revenue over protecting his long-term brand value. The lawsuit revealed what the 2022 deal had left unresolved. The contract was up for renegotiation in 2025. The expanded partnership wasn't a decade-long lock-in. It was a shorter-term extension, likely 3 years, designed to defer the question, not eliminate it. This is where the structure became visible. His streaming dominance over 6 years had given him negotiating power in 2022. Streaming's predictability as a revenue model made his future cash flows trackable in a way they hadn't been during the 2010s transition. That data made Drake valuable, but it also made the cost of weakening his position calculable for the label. He had held timing leverage in 2022 because his peers were selling catalogs for hundreds of millions. A partnership with ownership retention allowed him to benefit from future upside, while Universal secured continued releases. The company reduced their risk by keeping him in the system rather than losing him to independence or a competitor. But Drake's legal team argued that Universal had a conflict of interest. They owned his legacy catalog, his most lucrative early albums, but only partnered on his post-2022 releases. If his brand weakened, his leverage in the 2025 renegotiation would decline, allowing them to secure more favorable terms, but they would still own the valuable catalog regardless of what he did next. The structure created an incentive misalignment. The company could benefit from reducing Drake's negotiating power even if it hurt his current releases. The assumption that held before was simple. The label would always maximize his commercial value because it was in their interest. The event that disrupted it was the Kendrick feud, which showed that their interest in his current success might be secondary to their interest in controlling the terms of his next deal. The structural detail that suddenly mattered was the split ownership. Drake controlled his future, but Universal controlled his past. When the contract came up for renewal, the label held leverage because owning the hits that defined his career meant they could afford to let current releases underperform. The partnership had bought both sides time, but it had also created a deadline where the power dynamic would be tested again. The consequence wasn't that the deal failed, it was that the deal's deferred reckoning arrived exactly when the contract term required it. Bruce Springsteen's 2021 deal with Sony was a full catalog sale. Sony bought the entire catalog, masters and publishing, and owned all future revenue. The structure was clean. Cash now, ownership forever. The Drake's deal was the opposite. Ownership of future masters stayed with the artist. The structure was messy by design, split ownership, undisclosed terms, and a renegotiation window that made the deal temporary rather than permanent. Taylor Swift's 2018 deal with Republic Records also prioritized ownership retention. Swift moved to Republic specifically to own her future masters after losing control of her Big Machine catalog that she later had to re-record. She secured ownership and flexibility, but she didn't sign a deal with an expiration date that created pressure at renewal. Her deal avoided the structural conflict this one created. Jay-Z's 2008 deal with Live Nation was $150 million, 10-year partnership that included recording, touring, and endorsements, the first major 360 deal. It set a precedent for comprehensive partnerships, but it was a decade-long commitment with explicit revenue streams. This deal was shorter, less defined, and more dependent on renegotiation. The difference is what happens when the term ends. Catalog sellers walked away clean. Swift retained ownership and avoided renegotiation traps. This structure worked until it required renewal. And when renewal came, the label that held the legacy catalog had an incentive to reduce Drake's leverage. not protect it. The pattern that emerged after the lawsuit is clear. Partnership structures with split ownership and short terms don't eliminate conflict. They create a deadline where the power dynamic rebalances. At the critical moment, contract renewal in 2025 Universal held leverage because they owned the legacy catalog and could afford to let current releases underperform if it strengthened their negotiating position. The structural lesson: ownership retention doesn't matter if the other side owns the past you're still selling.